Hey everyone, welcome to Movie Marathons HQ, where we do movie marathons connected to new releases and where we enjoy and review some of our favorite movies. This video is part of the Avengers Doomsday Movie Marathon, where we are watching one movie every week as we prepare for the release of Avengers Doomsday in December 2026. Today we're discussing Iron Man 2. Released in 2010 and directed by Jon Favreau, this is the first sequel of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and our second time having an adventure with Tony Stark Iron Man. And overall, everyone knows that this is the weakest movie to this point in the MCU. I think there's a few things it has going for it, but it's not that good, and I have more negatives than I have positives to say about Iron Man 2. For positives, I will mention the additional casting and some of the visual effects. For negatives, I would mention the focus on Justin Hammer as the antagonist, the focus on Ivan Vanko as the villain, some of the other visual effects, and the meandering plot of the movie. Spoiler alert for Iron Man 2. The first positive to mention is the casting. As I mentioned in Iron Man, there's some phenomenal casting in that first movie, and then this second movie follows that up. Sarah Finn continues to do an incredible job finding the actors who fit these roles and these characters very well. So we already had Robert Downey Jr. and Gwyneth Paltrow, and we had Terrence Howard in the first movie as Rhodey, who becomes War Machine in this movie, but he was recast in this movie, and Don Cheadle portrays Rhodey. I do prefer Terrence Howard, to be totally honest. Don Cheadle's a very strong actor, and you get used to him, and he's been our Rhodey for the rest of the MCU. But that's not my favorite recast. But there are some new characters that are also introduced in Iron Man 2. We get introduced to Scarlett Johansson as Natalie Rushman, who ends up being Natasha Romanoff as the Black Widow. Turns out one of the Black Widows, but the Black Widow that we know and love. And she's great in this movie. She's duplicitous, and she's smart, and she's savvy, and uses every tool at her disposal. She's a bit of they do a running joke of Tony being attracted to her, which sort of works, sort of doesn't work. Those jokes are they're kind of played out. They're not funny. But they do that a lot. We also get introduced to Clark Gregg as Phil Coulson, who has a huge role in the Avengers. He was in the first movie, I know, for a brief minute, but we see more of him here and see more of his character, which is pretty cool. Sam Rockwell is Justin Hammer. He's very charismatic and very entertaining. I do have some negatives to say about him, but this is the first and almost only time we've seen him in the MCU. Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury is awesome. We saw him in the post-credit scene in Iron Man, but this is where, again, we see him in an actual role and actually shining. He's brilliant as Nick Fury. And this is a fun thing in the comics history, was Nick Fury used to be a Caucasian guy, and then when they were making the Ultimates universe and they wanted to reimagine some characters, they wanted to make him as an African-American character. And as the artists were trying to design him, they kept ending up on a Samuel L. Jackson looking character. So they contacted him and said, hey, can we use your likeness for this reimagined version of Nick Fury? And he said, yes, only if I get the exclusive rights to portray him if you ever make a movie about him. So he agreed to that from the beginning, and here he is, and that's really good. Also, Mickey Rourke had a comeback in Hollywood at this point. I don't think he's very strong in this role, though. It's kind of cool seeing him, and they tried some things with him, but he's going to be another negative later. So anyways, that was long-winded, but I think the casting in this movie builds on the first movie's casting, and that's very good. Another positive is the visual effects. There are some shots that don't work, which we'll talk about later, but the ones that do work really well. One of the highlights of the MCU to this point, but certainly in this movie, is on the racetrack in Monaco when Tony Stark uses his red and silver suitcase, and it's actually his Iron Man armor. That suit up scene is flat out awesome. It looks really cool. It's very, very well done. It feels like that whole suit fit into the suitcase, and the way he put it on worked to actually build it around him. And it builds on a really cool armor that he had in the comics, which is very popular with the red and silver. design. So that's a really cool scene. And then at the end, when they're fighting all the hammer drones, and when Rhodey comes in and his suit looks heavier and looks more built and looks different than Tony's, I think the visual effects work there. And then when they have their team up inside the Stark Expo dome thing, there's some really good visual effects there. So it's still a positive as they continue to make this metallic suit look like it's actually fitting on top of these two characters. This movie does introduce an interesting plot hole that's never super been addressed by Marvel Studios, except for an Endgame. But in the first movie, it makes sense that Tony's the only one who can use his Iron Man armor because he has the arc reactor in his chest, and you can't just put an arc reactor in somebody else's chest for the purposes of having a flight suit. So it makes sense that he's the only one who can fly it. But in this movie, he makes a suit specifically for Rhodey that will only work for Rhodey's DNA, which is interesting. So then why doesn't Tony Stark just make Iron Man suits for all of the heroes and first responders and all that kind of stuff? Maybe they don't really address why he doesn't. And in Endgame, they're going back in time. Quantum suits do have a Tony Stark design element to them, and it kind of looks like a protective nanotech armor that he gives to all of the Avengers as they go back through their time heist. So it's sort of addressed there, but it just seems like, I don't know why he doesn't make Iron Man suits of armor for all of the Avengers and many, many more, if it's not just him that can use it. Negative for this movie are the villains. So I mentioned two of them. Justin Hammer is introduced, played by Sam Rockwell, and he's very entertaining, but he's in the movie a lot. I feel like he's over focused on. There's just way too much time with him, and he didn't, to me, come across as antagonistic enough to warrant him being a villain. So he's kind of a nuisance. He's kind of there in the way, but he's also not incredibly disruptive. But the movie spent a lot of runtime and screen time on him, which I felt like was a strange balance. And then the main villain is Ivan Vanko, who from the comics is Whiplash. And so he's a rival kind of engineer guy, and he makes his own arc reactor in his own suit, but he decides to make whips instead of blaster things, I guess, which is fine. It's comic books, whatever. And so they take Mickey Rourke and they make him true to his heritage, which is a Russian character, but he's not intimidating. He kind of seems goofy. He seems smart, but then he doesn't seem smart. He just is very aloof throughout this whole movie. So you've got this charismatic villain who's got too much focus and too much screen time, and is like a rival Tony Stark, but you also kind of don't know why we're focusing on him. And then you have Whiplash, who's the true villain, but he just is kind of bland and doesn't really fit. So I think the villains are just a main negative for this movie. I mentioned that there are some very strong visual effects in this movie, but there also are some that are not as strong. I think Whiplash's suit looks good some of the time. It looks really bad at the end when he makes a bigger, chunkier suit. I just don't think that one looks like a CGI suit floating over top of a human character. It doesn't feel like it fits around him like the Iron Man suits do. And then at that racetrack scene in Monaco, a lot of those scenes just don't look very smooth in the visual effects. So I think that takes me out of the movie when I watch it, when we've got those visual effects that are not as strong. And the last negative to mention is just the meandering plot. So I mentioned before that the focus on the villains kind of takes us back and forth, and then they introduce some of Tony Stark's daddy issues, which are an interesting part of his character, I think, but it just seems like he's not resolving them, he's not addressing them, and he's also not ignoring them. They're just there and kind of around. And then they have this subplot where he needs to find some other power source for his arc reactor because it's making him sick and it's affecting him negatively, and so he's on a hunt to figure this out. And then it's just a lot of happenstance, which is how he figures it out. So it shows that yes, he is brilliant as a character, but it's also a lot of luck. And maybe that's the point, that science is a lot of talent plus luck. But then he creates a new element, which from my surface level understanding of chemistry in the periodic table here on planet Earth, I don't understand how you can make a new element that fits on the elemental chart. So they just kind of say he made a new element and it's what powers his his arc reactor in his suit, and then it allows them to make a little triangle-shaped window in his suit, which from the comics they go from circle to triangle to circle to triangle. But so between the daddy issues, the meandering villains, or the two villains that kind of go back and forth, creating a new element, and then also these hammer drones that are going to, take over a lot of things. It's just a very meandering plot. It doesn't feel streamlined, and it doesn't feel like it's working. Recognizing that this movie was filmed and produced during a writer's strike, and so that's a big part of why this doesn't work, and it makes it very tough to make a movie during a strike when you don't have access to those writers and those rewrites. So that's a big part of it, I recognize, but still the plot is just very meandering and doesn't feel like it hits home. Now, how might Iron Man 2 connect to Avengers Doomsday? So in universe, Tony Stark has died, and he dies in Avengers Endgame, but the actor Robert Downey Jr. is confirmed on the cast list for Doomsday to portray Victor Von Doom and Doctor Doom, the main villain. So we are going to see him again, but as a different character. I think they're going to go with a variant that in a different universe, Tony Stark was born and he's got a different name and a different history and a different backstory, and he becomes a villain in that universe, and he's somehow connected to ours. I think that's more likely than him being just a guy who looks like Tony Stark from America. I don't think that would work for the audience or for the characters in the universe. And then nobody else from the cast of this movie is confirmed to be in Doomsday. War Machine is still alive, so he could show up, although he's been replaced by a Skrull at some point in the timeline, so we don't know what's been truly Rhodey and what's been a Skrull. And Pepper Potts is still alive, and she did once suit up in an Iron Man suit of her own called Rescue, but I don't think she'll be in Doomsday either. So that's my review of Iron Man 2. What do you think of this movie, and how do you think it might connect to Avengers Doomsday? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. Follow Movie Marathons HQ on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and also on Letterboxd, where you can see all of the movie marathons we've done and some that we plan to do in the future. The next movie in this marathon is Thor. See you at the movies.